Discussing victories or wins for Palestine right now might seem delusional, insensitive even. After all, Israel spent nearly 10 months on a genocidal rampage which has killed tens of thousands of Palestinians, all facilitated and armed by the US and other Western governments, including, of course, the British government. Now, according to an open letter signed by 45 American physicians, surgeons, nurses who've worked in Gaza over those last 10 months, signed last week, it is likely that the death toll is already greater than 92,000. That is 4.2% of Gaza's population, or about 1 in 24 Palestinians in Gaza killed so far. But the scale of the horror and the role of Palestinian journalists at such cost, suffering the worst slaughter of journalists ever recorded in armed conflict in history, and the shift in public opinion in states which arm and back Israel, and the political consequences of that, well, that is having an impact. Now, in no way am I going to let off the British Labour government as I go on to explain, and the bar really is on the floor here, what's going on. Because what we're discussing here is, in many ways, the bare minimum. But when we're discussing genocide, the bare minimum matters. And as I'll discuss, this is testament to the role played by citizens using their voices in however flawed a democracy this happens to be to effect change. Now, back in May, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan QC, a British lawyer and indeed the brother of a former Conservative member of Parliament, issued requests for arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, with proposed charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, those requests must be approved by judges in a pre-trial chamber. Before the last general election, as a parting gift to Israel, the Conservative government of Rishi Sunak launched a wrecking attempt against these requests for arrest warrants. Now, the argument they were using is that the ICC does not have jurisdiction over war crimes committed in Palestine, given Israel is not a member of the ICC. This is a nonsense. Palestine became the 123rd member of the ICC back in 2015, so the best part of a decade ago. And it's been clearly established the ICC has jurisdiction to deal with war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Palestine, including by states which aren't members of the ICC. In any case, the pre-trial chamber agreed to allow the appeal to be heard. But given the UK general election, they extended the date for that to be heard by whoever happened to take power, and of course that was always going to be the Labour Party. Now, all of this has caused significant delay to the process of actually issuing arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant, who continue to commit some of the worst crimes and atrocities of our age. Today, for example, bombing yet another school, killing dozens of innocent people. Now, it's been weeks since the election, and it was originally briefed that the government was going to drop this wrecking attempt. But then an Israeli newspaper reported that following a visit to Israel, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy had backtracked and would continue this brazen attempt at sabotage. I got in touch with David Lammy's office for clarification. They didn't respond. Maybe they just didn't want to talk to me, which is a shame. I'm just a friendly little lad who likes to chat, after all. But then on Thursday, the brilliant media outlets Middle East Eye and Novara Media reported the government was going to drop the case, and this was then confirmed this Friday. Now, it really should be emphasised this is the bare minimum. It's simply a case of respecting international law and allowing a global institution, which Britain is a signatory member of, to do its work without outside interference. The bar really is on the floor. I'm afraid I'll come on to that. Now, it should be noted that a new YouGov poll finds that 54% of Britons believe an ICC arrest warrant should be issued for Benjamin Netanyahu. And the government isn't taking that position. It's simply saying the ICC should be allowed to do its work unimpeded without taking a position on the validity of the arrest warrants. They're not even in line with public opinion. But that doesn't mean we should dismiss progress. Clearly, we want arrest warrants to be issued. Many will go, well, will they ever be brought to justice? Very good question. Israeli leaders would seek, of course, in that event, to go to states which are signatories to the ICC to avoid arrest. We don't know, of course, how things will develop in the coming months and years. Clearly, Israeli impunity is falling apart in real time. But if you'd said a year ago that a request for an arrest warrant for war crimes and crimes against humanity were going to be issued against Netanyahu, well, the discovery of an alien civilization on Mars would have seemed more plausible to a lot of people. It would also represent another devastating blow against the Israeli state as public opinion shifts dramatically against it, given the genocidal onslaught it's unleashed. It may, for example, all over the world, arguing for sanctions, for arms embargoes. That would be much easier. Now, there has been other movement too in Britain. The British government has restored funding to UNRWA, the UN agency for Palestinian refugees and the main humanitarian agency in Gaza. That funding was suspended by the Conservative government in January. It must be said, Labour legitimised that decision at the time. Now, it should be regarded, quite frankly, as direct complicity in genocide. Trying to choke off funding for the main humanitarian agency during a humanitarian catastrophe will inevitably have lethal consequences. This decision was made on the basis of unsubstantiated smears made by the Israeli state against UNRWA, with an independent report finding no evidence to back them up, and a dossier offered by Israel being taken apart by the likes of the Financial Times and Channel 4 News. Other countries restored funding, I should say, to UNRWA months ago. The EU as a whole reinstated that funding back in March, along with individually the likes of Sweden, France, Canada. Then in April, Japan, indeed Germany, Israel's staunchest ally really after the US. Well, again, this is the bare minimum. It's not not actively facilitating genocide by strangling the main humanitarian agency in Gaza months after other governments have already reversed that decision. It's still progress, though. Now, it's also believed that the UK government will publish legal advice on Israel's compliance with international law, which is obviously believed to state what we all know, that Israel is in violation of international law, to say the least. Anyone who doesn't believe that by now should be regarded as an atrocity denier of the worst kind. And that, as a consequence of that advice, the UK will ban some arms sales. That is offensive weapons rather than what is termed defensive weapons. Now, the UK doesn't sell that many weapons to Israel in the grand scheme of things, compared to the US and indeed after that Germany, but it still sells weapons which kill people. And those weapons help commit egregious war crimes. It's believed the foreign aid workers, you'll remember the World Central Kitchen attack, including Britons, were killed in April with weapons it's believed were included British components. Now, we need clarity on exactly what the ban means. It should mean all weapons. But again, it's just a bare minimum. The British government is obliged to seek legal advice from states it sells weapons to. I mean, it's legally obliged to end arms sales to states in violation of international humanitarian law. We are here simply discussing abiding by the law. But nonetheless, it will put pressure on Labour and, it'll put pressure on other states to follow the Labour government's example, who arm Israel, principally, as I mentioned there, the US, followed by Germany, to do the same. Now, even the bare minimum has caused outrage from apologists for the Israeli state. Labour Friends of Israel has issued a legally illiterate statement in which they call the chief prosecutor's case, which is backed by an array of prestigious lawyers, which I doubt LFI can say the same, as morally suspect and legally dubious, suggesting it's launching a case against a country with a robust, independent and fully functioning judicial system, that Israel has jailed previous leaders and it's already investigating serious misconduct relating to the war. Now, the only legal basis for Israel to avoid this ICC case, the ICC case, is if it can credibly show that its own judicial system would pursue the same charges against Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister with a justice system with actual integrity. Now, the ICC intervenes on the basis of war crimes and crimes against humanity, which will not credibly be investigated by the justice system of the country in question. That's what they have to conclude. Now, they say previous Israeli leaders have been jailed. I've been doing digging there. What they're referring to there, for example, is a previous Israeli president, Moshe Katsav, who was jailed for rape, obstruction of justice, among other things, and the former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who was convicted of bribery and breach of trust, yeah. Now, they've never jailed previous leaders, of course, for crimes committed against Palestinians. That's what we're discussing here. There's no serious investigation to any of the atrocities being committed in Gaza or elsewhere. I mean, it's a travesty to suggest that's happening. No evidence for that whatsoever. Now, meanwhile, the Board of Deputies of British Jews has issued its own, frankly, extraordinary statement in conjunction with the Jewish Leadership Council about a reversal of long-term UK foreign policy, which they're bemoaning, about how they say many in the Jewish community are assessing whether this government still will stand by words in opposition about supporting Israel's right to self-defense, that they say it comes on top of restoring funding for UNRWA, which they previously suggested they wanted abolished, and signal a significant shift in policy away from Israel being a key UK ally, and that this would be not only a strategic error, but also a moral one. Now, I don't want to be brutal here, but what the hell has it got to do with you? Why are you sticking your oar in? Now, as a member of a minority group myself, I think it's really important that minorities have collective, organised representation. And Jewish people in Britain and beyond have a very long history of suffering violent and murderous persecution, and to this day still suffer here in Britain bigotry and prejudice. We are discussing here the International Criminal Court pursuing allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity against a foreign state. A British communal organisation lobbying for the British government to wreck that. I mean, what the hell? Similarly, the chief rabbi has requested a meeting with the Prime Minister to express his deep concerns. Well, again, this isn't about the interests of Jewish Britons. This is lobbying in support of not actually just the foreign state, but specifically the government and Prime Minister of that state. Now, some may recall the controversy over the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which has been accused of stifling criticism of Israel and has been adopted across the Western world, including officially by the UK government, with multiple institutions following suit. Park that controversy for a moment. One of the examples given for anti-Semitism in that definition is holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the State of Israel. Now, regardless of the wider controversies over the IHRA examples in particular, there shouldn't be any controversy over that one at all. That is anti-Semitism, clearly. So how is the behaviour of the Board of Deputies and the Chief Rabbi consistent with the demarcation we should all insist on between the Jewish people, in this case specifically Jewish Britons, and the Israeli state? What they're doing here is trashing that demarcation. It's hideously irresponsible behaviour. The British government should very politely tell the Chief Rabbi and Board of Deputies, thank you very much for your correspondence. You're entitled, of course, to publicly express your opinions and use your free speech as you see fit. But I'm afraid this actually has nothing to do with you, and we will not be meeting with you to discuss this issue further. But we are always happy to discuss issues facing the Jewish community in Britain, not least to protect the rights of Jewish people here to live happy and secure and safe lives. Does that sound unreasonable to you? I think it's pretty fair, if I'm honest. Now, finally, I want to refer to something posted by one of the sorest losers in British democratic history. There's no dignity involved here whatsoever. His name is Jonathan Ashworth. He's a former Shadow Cabinet Minister who's been throwing quite the tantrum since he was defeated in his seat of Leicester South at the hands of local optometrist Shocker Adam, who I've interviewed. Lovely guy. Striking is it that when Labour lost support in the so-called red wall areas, the response then was we need to listen, we need to learn, we need to rebuild trust, reconnect, which was often interpreted by politicians in practice as clamping down on migrants. But when areas with large numbers of British Muslim voters exercise their democratic rights, in part but not in whole because of their objection to genocide, well, it's been quite a different story, hasn't it? And that's why you can't go, woo, Labour, go you. Because in opposition, Labour could have put pressure on the last government when public opinion was frankly on side from pretty much the beginning. They failed to do so. At the start, Keir Starmer backed Israel's right to cut off water and energy, a war crime, then denied he'd said what he'd said. Keir Starmer purged Labour MPs who took a stand. When predominantly Muslim councillors resigned, Labour said they were shaking off the fleas. They backed Israel's genocidal rampage for months. They opposed the end to arms sales. They legitimised pulling the plug on UNRWA. They refused to vote for a ceasefire in November and kicked out shallow ministers who did. They only voted for a ceasefire after 137 days of mass murder and tens of thousands killed, and only when the Scottish National Party cornered them over it and then they stripped out references to Israel's collective punishment. We could go on. We don't need to give them some special cookie. And I'm not going to do that. And what Jonathan Ashworth said is false. You know, this idea, these, it keeps saying impotent and irrelevant independent candidates. They won't have any impact on policy on Palestine and Israel, presumably unlike the incredible work he's been doing behind the scenes. Yeah, I'm sure you've been doing great stuff, Jonathan, trying to shift Labour's position. The fact is, 4 pro-Gaza independents defeated Labour MPs, including the Shadow Cabinet Minister, Jonathan Ashworth, who has clearly been in personal turmoil ever since, because, as well, at the same time, the Greens surged. They defeated the Shadow Minister, Thangam Debonair. The Greens came a strong second behind Labour in dozens of seats. Other candidates, independent candidates, came close, including nearly defeating Health Secretary Wes Streeting. I'm talking there about the young British Palestinian candidate Leanne Mohammed in Ilford. And Wes Streeting is the heir apparent to Keir Starmer. Now, all of that happened before Labour was even in power, when they really do start pissing off people, governments. And that's on the basis of having won 2/3 of seats based on 1/3 of the vote at the lowest turnout in democratic history. A Jenga tower landslide in danger of easily toppling over. Well, it's because of all that they came under pressure. They're just responding to that pressure, because otherwise they're just risking losing more and more voters when they're in power and bolstering Greens and independents. They've just kicked out 7 Labour MPs and they're just going to keep swelling the ranks of a left opposition which can win in seats. We've seen that already. I mean, I didn't even mention, Jeremy Corbyn there, the former leader of the Labour Party, who they thought, they'd beat him in Islington North. I mean, look, I'm, fine if they want to behave like that. But obviously the priority here isn't partisan and political games. It's the people of Palestine who are suffering a genocide. That's what I'm concerned about. And obviously we'll support anything which helps prevent this atrocity. But that's what this is really about, isn't it? It's about how we build that pressure. And the lesson is to up the ante. The people running Labour would never have done these things unless they felt forced to. These are, what we're talking about is the bare minimum. What we should really expect is action proportionate to what's actually happening, namely a genocide being committed by Israel with Western arms and support. And that should mean Britain imposing sanctions on Israel, immediately recognising the state of Palestine, as most countries on earth have done, most notably recently the likes of Spain, Norway, Ireland, as well as actively supporting the ICC case and the International Court of Justice case as well. The pressure's working. We need to keep it up. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your comments, your thoughts. Help keep the show on the road at patreon.com/OJS84. Listen to some podcasts and speak to them.